He rebuilt her ruined homestead, and by sundown he realized he had just uncovered a love story his own blood had tried to bury. The first board he lifted came loose too easily, dry as old paper, splintering in his hands under the late September sun. Elias Whitaker stood there for a moment, boots planted in 6 inches of red Oklahoma dust, staring at the hollow space beneath the floor where Clara Bennett's kitchen used to be. The wind moved through the broken rafters above, carrying the smell of cedar and ash left over from the fire that had taken half the house the winter before. Clara stood 20 feet away near the split-rail fence, arms folded tight against the morning chill, pretending she wasn't watching every swing of his hammer. She had lost her husband 2 years back to a fever that swept through 3 counties, and since then the homestead had sagged inch by inch, like it too was tired of standing alone. Folks in town offered sympathy in church pews, but not lumber, not nails, not the kind of help that leaves blisters. Elias hadn't offered words either. He had simply shown up at sunrise with a wagon full of salvaged beams and a tin of square-cut nails older than both of them. He told himself it was because no house deserved to lean into the prairie wind like that, not when it still had good bones. The first few days passed in quiet rhythm. Hammer, measure, saw. The sound carried across 80 acres of open land where cattle once grazed thick and healthy. Clara would bring out coffee in a chipped enamel mug around mid-morning, setting it down on an overturned crate without stepping too close. They spoke in simple sentences about lumber lengths and whether the frost would come early this year. Nothing about loneliness. Nothing about the way the evenings stretched long after sundown. By the 4th day, Elias had stripped back most of the damaged flooring in what used to be the front room. The foundation stones were solid, laid straight by someone who knew what he was doing at least 50 years ago. He slid his shovel under a patch of hardened earth near the hearth, meaning only to level it before resetting the boards. The blade struck something that rang low and metallic, not loud, but different from stone. He paused, wiped his brow with the back of his glove, and listened as if the prairie itself might explain it. Another scrape. This time, no mistaking it. Metal. He crouched down, brushing away packed dirt with careful hands until the edge of a small iron box appeared, rusted along the corners but sealed tight. It had been buried deep, beneath the original floor, placed there before the house had ever fully settled. Clara stepped closer then, drawn by the sudden stillness. "Find something?" she asked, her voice steady but thinner than usual. Elias lifted the box free, feeling its unexpected weight. Not heavy like tools, heavy like memory. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the house frame rising around them, at the new beams fitted against old stone, at the life she was trying to piece back together. Then he pried the lid open with the tip of his hammer, slow and careful, as if whatever lay inside deserved more respect than the dirt that had hidden it. And when he saw the faded photograph resting on top of a bundle of letters tied in twine, when he recognized the face of the young man standing beside a woman in front of this very homestead, Elias felt the ground shift beneath him in a way no storm ever could. Because the man in that picture carried his father's eyes, and the woman was wearing the Bennett family locket Clara still kept in her dresser drawer, and suddenly rebuilding a house didn't feel like carpentry anymore. It felt like reopening a promise the prairie had tried to swallow whole. The prairie went quiet in a way that did not belong to wind or weather. Elias held the photograph between his fingers, careful not to crease the faded edges, while Clara stepped closer until her shadow crossed the open foundation. The picture had been taken in front of the same homestead when it was new, the board straight, the porch rail unbroken, the fields behind it thick with tall grass that reached a man's waist. The young woman in the photograph wore a plain cotton dress and the silver locket that Clara now kept tucked away in her dresser. The young man beside her stood stiff, hat in hand, eyes fixed not on the camera but on her, as if even then he knew the moment would not last. Elias swallowed once before turning the photograph so Clara could see it clearly. She did not speak at first. Her fingers rose slowly to her throat, though the locket was not there today. "That is my grandmother," she said finally, her voice steady but lower than before. Elias nodded. "And that is my father." The words settled between them like dust after a long ride. He had grown up hearing little about his father's early years. There were stories about cattle drives, about winters spent near the Arkansas line, about work done with steady hands and few complaints. There were no stories about a woman named Bennett. Elias reached into the iron box again and drew out the bundle of letters tied with sun-bleached twine. The paper felt brittle, edges curled from decades underground. He hesitated only a second before loosening the knot. Clara watched his hands, not the letters. The first page he unfolded carried careful handwriting in dark ink that had faded to brown. The date at the top read June 3rd, 1878. Elias read silently at first, eyes moving slowly across words written by a younger version of the man he had known only as stern and quiet. The letter spoke of fence lines and early corn shoots, of evenings spent sitting on the unfinished porch of a new house. It spoke of laughter carried across open land and of plans to leave before the first frost. Elias exhaled softly, then handed the page to Clara without comment. She read it herself, lips pressing thin at certain lines, eyes lingering where the ink pressed hardest into the paper. They were going to leave, she murmured. Go west. Together. Elias nodded again. Another letter lay beneath the first, dated 2 months later. This one carried a different tone, heavier somehow. The handwriting slanted as if written in haste. It spoke of families who would not accept such a union, of old grudges over land and pride, of neighbors who measured loyalty in acres and last names. It spoke of choosing peace over passion, of stepping back so that no one else would be forced to choose sides. Elias felt the weight of that decision settle into his chest. He looked up at Clara, standing in the shell of a house their grandparents once meant to share. The new beams he had raised that week framed the sky above her, blue and wide and indifferent. They did not run, Clara said quietly. They stayed for everyone else. Elias folded the letters carefully and placed them back into the iron box, though he did not close the lid. The house around them no longer felt simply burned or broken. It felt paused, as if the prairie had been waiting all these years for someone to uncover what had been buried beneath its floorboards. And in the stillness that followed, rebuilding a home began to feel less like charity and more like inheritance. The sun dipped lower over the prairie, turning the open sky the color of worn copper as Elias set the iron box on a plank that would soon become Clara Bennett's new kitchen floor. Neither of them reached for it again right away. The wind moved through the upright beams, humming softly against fresh-cut lumber, as if the house itself was listening. Clara walked to the edge of the foundation and looked out over her land, 80 acres stretching flat and stubborn toward the horizon. The grass had thinned over the years, and the barn leaned a few degrees more than it should, but the soil was still good. Her grandmother used to say that the land remembered who loved it. Clara had always believed that meant hard work and steady hands. Now she wondered if it also meant unfinished promises. Elias remained where he stood, eyes resting on the open letters. He tried to picture his father at 25, standing in that very yard with hope in his chest instead of the quiet, restrained Elias had known all his life. He remembered how his father would sometimes ride past this property without slowing, gaze fixed straight ahead, jaw set like carved stone. At the time, Elias had thought it was pride or indifference. Now he understood it might have been something else entirely. Regret did not always shout. Sometimes it simply rode on. Clara stepped back toward him, boots pressing into loose dirt. My grandmother never spoke his name, she said. Not once. But she never married until she was nearly 40. Elias nodded slowly. My father married my mother young. Everyone said it was practical. The word hung there. Practical. As if love were something that could be measured in acres and cattle head. Clara crouched beside the box and lifted the photograph again, studying the expression on her grandmother's face. It was not dramatic, not reckless. It was steady, certain, the kind of look a woman gives when she has chosen something with her whole heart. They gave it up so no one else would have to choose sides, she said quietly. Elias looked at the new frame rising around them. Fresh beams anchored to old stone. And the sides do not even exist anymore, he replied. The neighboring families who once argued over fence lines had long since moved away or been laid to rest beneath simple wooden crosses. The grudges that once felt permanent had faded into stories no one bothered to repeat. Only this house had remained, holding its silence beneath warped boards and weathered shingles. Clara closed the iron box gently, this time with care rather than secrecy. If they had left, she said, this place would never have been built. Elias considered that. The homestead, the fields, even Clara's presence here, all of it traced back to a choice made in restraint rather than rebellion. Sacrifice had shaped the land as surely as rain and plow. He reached for his hammer again, feeling its familiar weight settle into his palm. "Then we build it right," he said, not as a favor, not as charity, but as something owed to more than just the present. Clara met his eyes, and for the first time since he had arrived 4 days ago, there was no guarded distance there. Only recognition. Not of romance. Not yet, but of shared inheritance. The prairie wind pressed gently against the rising walls, and in the fading light, the house no longer looked like a ruin. It looked like a second chance that had waited nearly 50 years to be claimed. Morning came slow and pale over the prairie, a thin silver light stretching across the open land as Elias arrived before sunrise with another load of lumber strapped tight in the back of his wagon. The air carried the bite of early fall, just enough to make breath visible in short clouds. Clara was already awake, standing near the well with a shawl drawn over her shoulders, watching the horizon as if measuring how much of it she still owned. The frame of the house stood stronger now, straight lines cutting against the wide sky, no longer apologizing for its scars. Elias climbed down from the wagon, without a word, and began unloading 2x4s, stacking them in neat piles beside the porch steps he had rebuilt the day before. Each board he set down felt less like charity and more like testimony. The iron box remained on the crate inside the unfinished front room, closed but not hidden, as if both of them understood that some things were meant to be remembered, not reburied. By mid-morning the sun had climbed high enough to warm the wood beneath their hands. Elias worked on fitting the new window frame into the east wall, measuring twice before driving each nail. Clara held the level steady, her fingers brushing the smooth grain where smoke had once blackened the boards. They moved around each other more easily now, no longer strangers divided by courtesy. "My grandmother kept that locket polished," Clara said after a while, eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the open wall, even when there was no one left who knew why. Elias tapped a nail flush with careful precision. "My father kept a small patch of this land on his map," he replied. "He never grazed cattle here. Said the grass was better left alone." The words carried weight that did not need explaining. Silence followed, not heavy, but thoughtful. The prairie stretched out before them in miles of quiet truth, fence lines barely visible against the pale gold of drying grass. Around noon, Elias climbed down from the ladder and wiped his hands on a clean rag. He stepped inside the open frame and paused near the crate. He lifted the iron box and set it gently on the new floor joist, positioning it where the hearth would stand once more. "They built this house for a future they never claimed," he said, his voice steady. Clara stepped beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Then maybe we honor that future by not wasting it," she answered. There was no rush in her tone, no suggestion beyond the simple truth of rebuilding what had been lost. Elias nodded once. Outside, a pair of meadowlarks crossed the sky, their shadows gliding over fresh timber and old stone alike. He picked up his hammer again and moved toward the doorway, setting the final support beam into place with deliberate care. Each strike echoed clear and certain, not loud, but firm enough to carry across the open fields. The house no longer felt like a monument to what could have been. It felt like a quiet continuation. And as the afternoon light filtered through the new frame, casting long bars of gold across the floor, Elias understood that some legacies were not inherited in land or name, but in the choice to build where others once stood still. The roof went on the following week beneath a sky that held no clouds and no mercy from the sun. Elias balanced along the rafters with the steady patience of a man who had learned that good work outlasted applause. Each shingle he laid down overlapped the last with careful precision, sealing out the wind that had once wandered freely through Clara Bennett's rooms. Below him, Clara sorted through salvaged hinges and doorknobs on a wooden crate, setting aside anything that still carried strength beneath the soot. The iron box rested on the new mantel beam inside, no longer hidden in dirt, yet not displayed like a trophy either. It sat there as quiet witness. Around midday, Elias climbed down and stood back to study the lines of the house. The structure no longer leaned. The porch posts were straight, the windows squared against the horizon. It looked like something that intended to endure. Clara stepped beside him, brushing sawdust from her skirt. "It almost looks like it never burned," she said softly. Elias shook his head once. "It burned," he replied. "It just did not end there." The words carried more than carpentry. She glanced at him, understanding passing between them without weight. That afternoon they worked on setting the front door, an old oak slab Clara had kept stored in the barn, untouched by the fire. The wood bore scratches and sun-faded varnish, but its core remained solid. As Elias fitted it into the new frame, Clara retrieved the silver locket from her dresser drawer and returned to the doorway. She held it in her palm for a moment before stepping inside. "My grandmother wore this until the day she passed," she said. "She never said why she kept it." Elias accepted the locket gently, turning it over in his calloused fingers. The hinge still moved smoothly. Inside was a small pressed flower, brittle with age. No photographs, no initials, just a fragment of something once alive. He looked at the mantel where the iron box rested, and then back at the doorway. Without ceremony, he drove a small finishing nail into the inner frame of the door, just above eye level, and hung the locket there where morning light would touch it first. Clara watched in silence. There was no grand gesture in the act, no claim made, only acknowledgement. When the door swung closed for the first time, it moved cleanly, fitting flush against the frame as if it had been waiting for that moment. The latch caught with a soft click that echoed steady in the still air. Outside, the prairie stretched open and wide, indifferent to past grievances and old boundaries. Elias stepped back onto the porch and rested his hands on the new railing. Clara joined him, their shoulders nearly aligned as they faced the land that had shaped both their families in different ways. "They chose peace," she said quietly. Elias nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon where earth met sky. "Then we do not undo it," he answered. The wind moved gently across the grass, brushing against the rebuilt walls and carrying the faint scent of fresh timber into the evening air. The house stood complete behind them, not as a monument to what was lost, but as proof that some promises do not fade. They simply wait for the right hands to finish what was started. Autumn settled in without announcement, just a cooler edge in the wind and a sharper blue to the sky. The house stood finished now, its boards pale and clean against the wide Oklahoma prairie, smoke rising thin and steady from the rebuilt chimney each evening. Elias had returned to his own ranch 2 miles east, yet his wagon tracks still marked the path between the two properties, pressed into the earth like a quiet habit. Clara moved through her restored rooms with a kind of measured gratitude, touching the mantel as she passed, glancing at the silver locket that caught the morning light where it hung inside the doorframe. The iron box remained on the hearth, not locked away, but not opened again either. Some truths did not need constant handling. One late afternoon, as the sun lowered itself toward the wheat-colored horizon, Elias rode back over on his bay mare, hat tipped low against the glare. He dismounted without ceremony and tied the reins to the porch rail he had sanded smooth. With his own hands, Clara stepped outside before he could knock, as if she had sensed the rhythm of hoofbeats across the open land. "Fence line on the north side is sagging," he said simply. "I brought posts." She nodded once. No surprise, no pretense. They walked the boundary together, boots brushing through grass that reached nearly to their calves. The old fence had leaned for years, wire slack between weathered posts that no longer held firm. Elias set the first new post deep into the soil, measuring the depth with steady eyes, making sure it would not shift with the first hard wind. Clara held the wire taut while he secured it, their hands moving in practiced coordination. There was something honest about mending a fence that did not belong to either of them alone, but to the land itself. As they worked their way down the line, Elias finally spoke what had been settling in his mind since the house was completed. "My father never spoke of regret," he said, eyes fixed on the horizon rather than on her. "But he kept this stretch of land untouched. I think this was his apology." Clara adjusted her grip on the wire, considering his words. "My grandmother planted apple trees behind the barn," she replied. "She said it was for shade one day. They never bore much fruit. Maybe she was planting hope instead." The wind carried their voices away as quickly as they offered them, leaving only the sound of wire tightening and wood settling firm into earth. By the time the last post stood straight, the fence line ran clean and strong from one end of the property to the other, no longer sagging, no longer dividing by weakness. Elias stepped back, hands resting on his hips, studying the work. The boundary remained, but it no longer felt like separation. It felt defined, chosen. Clara stood beside him, the fading light soft against her face. They gave up their chance so others would not be forced to choose, she said quietly. Elias nodded. We are not choosing sides, he answered. We are choosing to stay. The prairie answered with silence, vast and patient. In that stillness, beneath a sky stretching endless and clear, the land no longer carried the weight of unfinished promises. It carried something steadier. Not passion that burned bright and vanished, but commitment that endured. Like timber set deep and wire pulled tight. And as Elias mounted his horse to ride back across the open miles, he did not look away from Clara's porch as he once had. He looked straight at it, knowing that some inheritances are not burdens to escape, but foundations to build upon. Winter settled fully over the prairie by the time the first rail snow came, not heavy, but enough to soften the sharp lines of fence posts and porch rails beneath a clean white hush. Clara Bennett stood at her front window at dawn, watching the light stretch pale across her land, and for a moment she imagined how it must have looked nearly 50 years earlier when her grandmother first stood there with plans that were never spoken aloud. The house felt different in winter. The walls held warmth steady. The floors no longer creaked with cold air slipping through unseen cracks. The silver locket inside the doorway caught even the faintest glint of morning light, a small bright point against the quiet interior. 2 miles east, Elias Whitaker finished feeding his cattle before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. The air carried the clean, metallic scent of snow, and each breath rose in white clouds before disappearing. He paused by his barn door, looking west toward Clara's land, then reached back inside for something wrapped in a wool blanket. It was a narrow wooden plank, sanded smooth, the grain tight and straight. He had carved letters into it by hand over several evenings beside his lantern, slow and deliberate, each stroke measured. By mid-morning he rode across the snow-dusted prairie, the mare's hooves pressing clear tracks into untouched white. Clara met him at the porch, her boots leaving smaller prints beside his as he dismounted. He did not speak at first. He simply unwrapped the plank and held it out. The carving read in clean block letters, Bennett Whitaker Homestead. Clara's breath caught, though no sound followed. She looked at the name, then at him. It was never meant to be divided, he said quietly. The wind moved around them, lifting loose strands of her hair beneath her hat. Nor claimed, she answered, her voice steady. Elias nodded once. Then we do not claim it. We share it. There was no ring offered, no grand declaration beneath the winter sky. Only a simple acknowledgement that the land had carried 2 names long before either of them stood here, and it no longer needed to pretend otherwise. Together they stepped onto the porch, Elias holding the sign while Clara steadied the ladder. He secured it above the doorway, just beneath the roofline, the wood firm against the rebuilt beams. When he stepped down, they stood side by side in silence, looking at the joined names against fresh timber. Snow began to fall again, light and unhurried, settling across the prairie in a slow, even drift. The fence line remained straight. The apple trees stood supported and patient beneath their thin coats of white. Inside, the iron box rested on the hearth, no longer a buried secret, but a quiet foundation. Clara slipped her hand into Elias's, not in urgency, not in fear of losing something, but in recognition of what had already been found. The prairie stretched wide before them, carrying no memory of grudges, no echo of old resistance. Only open land and the steady rhythm of seasons that did not favor one name over another. And beneath a winter sky that held both silence and promise, the house stood as proof that some love stories are not meant to burn bright and vanish. They are meant to wait, patient as the land itself, until the right hands are willing to build them anew. The snow did not last long that year. By late February, the prairie began to show through in patches, dark earth breaking the white, in uneven shapes like ink spreading across paper. Clara Bennett stood beneath the newly mounted sign one morning and traced the carved letters with her eyes, not as possession, but as acknowledgement. The joined names had already begun to weather slightly from wind and frost, softening at the edges as if they had always belonged together. Inside, the house carried the steady scent of wood smoke and clean timber. The iron box remained on the hearth, unopened since winter began, yet never forgotten. Elias Whitaker rode over less often during the deepest cold, his ranch demanding longer hours, but the path between their lands stayed visible even after each light snowfall, pressed firm by returning hoofbeats. When March came, it brought longer daylight and a subtle shift in the air. The apple trees behind the barn showed the smallest swelling at their tips, buds forming where last year there had only been stubborn branches. Clara noticed it first. She called Elias over without urgency, simply pointing to the thin green promise at the edge of a twig. He bent closer, removing his gloves, studying the fragile growth with careful eyes. "They never bore fruit before," she said softly. Elias straightened and looked toward the horizon, where the fields stretched patient and open. "Maybe they were waiting," he replied. The wind moved gently across the land, no longer sharp, carrying with it the faint scent of thawing soil. That afternoon, they opened the iron box once more, not to search for answers, but to read the final letter together in full daylight. They sat at the kitchen table Elias had built from leftover oak, the paper laid flat between them. The words spoke of gratitude rather than sorrow, of choosing family over flight, of trusting that love did not disappear simply because it changed form. Clara folded the letter carefully when they finished and placed it back inside. "They believed the land would remember," she said. Elias nodded slowly. And it did. Later, as they walked the fence line again, now free of frost, Clara paused near the boundary where the two properties met. There was no visible marker beyond the sturdy posts they had set months earlier. The line existed, but it did not divide. Elias stood beside her, hands resting easy at his sides. "We could take down this section," she suggested quietly, glancing at the stretch of fence between their lands. Elias considered it, then shook his head once. "Let it stand," he said. "Not as a wall, as a choice." Clara understood. The fence was no longer about keeping distance. It was about honoring ground that had been shaped by restraint, by patience, by decisions made without spectacle. As the first true warmth of spring settled across the prairie, sunlight caught the silver locket inside the doorway and reflected outward in a brief, bright flash. The apple trees held their swelling buds against a wide blue sky, and somewhere beneath the rebuilt floorboards, beneath timber and stone, the earth that had once hidden a secret now held nothing but roots reaching deeper. The past had not been erased. It had been acknowledged, set in its rightful place. And in the open space between two once separate names, something steady had taken hold, quiet as growth. Beneath the soil, certain as the seasons turning without asking permission, spring came fully awake in April, and the prairie turned a living green that stretched mile after mile beneath a sky rinsed clean by recent rain. Clara Bennett stood at the edge of the apple trees one early morning, sunlight filtering through new leaves that had finally opened where last year there had been only stubborn branches. Small white blossoms dotted the limbs, delicate but certain. Elias Whitaker approached on foot this time, having left his mare grazing near the fence, choosing instead to walk the last stretch across softened ground. The earth gave slightly beneath his boots, rich and dark, carrying the scent of growth rather than frost. He paused beside Clara without speaking, both of them looking up at the blossoms as if they were something rare. "They did not give up," Clara said quietly, brushing her fingers along a branch without disturbing the petals. Elias shook his head once. "They were rooted too deep." The words carried weight beyond the trees. Behind them, the house stood firm and settled, the carved sign above the doorway weathering gently under sun and rain. The silver locket still caught light each morning, a small glint visible even from the yard when the door stood open. Inside, the iron box remained on the hearth, no longer a secret, no longer a question. It had become part of the house's quiet architecture. That afternoon, a neighbor from 3 miles south rode by, tipping his hat as he passed along the county road. His gaze lingered briefly on the joined names above the door, then shifted to the straight fence line and the orderly fields beyond. He said nothing, only nodded once before continuing on. The land had a way of settling its own rumors. Later, Elias and Clara stood together at the boundary where their properties met. The fence remained upright and true, wire drawn tight, posts sunk deep. On Elias's side, cattle grazed calmly across fresh pasture. On Clara's, the apple blossoms shimmered in the breeze. "It is strange," Clara said, her eyes tracing the horizon. They thought leaving together would cause harm, so they stayed apart. Elias considered the open miles before them, and in staying apart, they kept peace long enough for this, he replied, gesturing not just to the house, but to the land, the trees, the simple fact of standing there without fear of old divisions. Clara turned to him, the wind lifting the edge of her hair. Then maybe their choice was not a loss, she said. Elias met her gaze steadily. Maybe it was a seed. The words settled between them, simple and true. The apple trees behind the barn carried blossoms that promised fruit for the first time in decades. The fence line did not feel like a barrier, only a line drawn in respect. And the house, once reduced to char and silence, now held the steady rhythm of footsteps and shared mornings. As the sun lowered toward the western hills, casting long shadows across both properties alike, Elias understood something his father had never spoken aloud. Love did not always claim what it wanted. Sometimes it chose restraint so that something stronger could grow in its place. And standing there beneath a sky wide enough for two names, he felt no trace of what had been buried. Only the quiet certainty that what endured was never meant to be hidden again. By late May, the apple blossoms had fallen, leaving behind small green fruit no larger than marbles, clinging stubbornly to slender branches that once refused to bear anything at all. Clara Bennett stood beneath the trees at sunrise, counting them the way her grandmother used to count fence posts after a storm, not out of doubt, but out of care. The air carried warmth now, a steady softness that settled over the prairie without apology. Elias Whitaker approached from the west pasture, having finished mending a gate before the cattle stirred fully awake. He rested his forearms on the fence rail, watching Clara from a distance before stepping closer. They held, he said, nodding toward the fruit. Clara allowed herself a small smile. So did we. The words were not dramatic. They did not need to be. Behind them, the house stood calm and lived in, the carved sign above the door weathered just enough to look earned rather than new. The silver locket inside the doorway caught the morning light and reflected it faintly onto the floorboards Elias had set months ago. Inside, the iron box remained on the hearth, unopened since the first warm days of spring. It no longer called for attention. It had already done its work. That afternoon, a letter arrived from the county office regarding property lines and tax assessments. Clara read it at the kitchen table while Elias leaned against the counter, hat resting beside him. The document listed their lands separately, in the old formal language of acreage and boundary descriptions measured in chains and rods. Clara folded it carefully and set it aside. On paper, she said, nothing has changed. Elias looked around the room, at the beams he had raised, the table he had built, the hearth that now held steady fire each night. On paper, maybe not, he replied. On the ground, everything has. They stepped outside together as the sun climbed high, walking the fence line once more. The post stood firm, the wire drawn straight, not as division but as acknowledgement of stewardship. Cattle grazed peacefully on Elias's side, while Clara's apple trees cast small, growing shadows across her field. The boundary existed, but it no longer carried weight. They protected their families, Clara said after a long silence. They chose peace even if it meant distance. Elias nodded slowly. And because they did, we stand here without having to choose between blood and land. The prairie wind moved steadily across both properties alike, bending grass in one direction without favor. A hawk circled high overhead, tracing invisible lines that did not belong to any surveyor's map. Clara looked toward the joined names above her doorway, and then back at the open miles stretching east and west. Maybe the greatest inheritance they left was restraint, she said. Elias considered that. His father had never spoken of lost chances, only of keeping promises. Clara's grandmother had never named her sorrow, only tended trees that refused to bloom. Yet here they were, beneath a sky that held no memory of old quarrels, watching fruit take shape where none had before. As the afternoon light deepened and shadows lengthened across both fields, Elias understood that some legacies are not about claiming what was denied. They are about honoring the quiet strength that made room for something better to grow. And in the gentle rustle of leaves against warm air, there was no echo of regret. Only the steady sound of a future taking root, one season at a time. By mid-July, the apples had grown heavy enough to bend the branches. green turning slowly toward a muted red beneath long afternoons of steady sun. Clara Bennett stood on a wooden crate beneath the tallest tree, reaching carefully to test the weight of the fruit in her palm. The skin felt firm, warm from daylight, alive in a way that seemed almost improbable after so many seasons of emptiness. Elias Whitaker approached from the pasture with 2 empty baskets hooked over his arm, his stride unhurried, his hat shading his eyes against the bright Oklahoma sky. He paused a few feet away, looking up at Clara balanced among leaves and sunlight. "They are ready," she said quietly, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. Elias set the baskets down and steadied the crate with one hand while she twisted the first apple free. It came loose without resistance. No struggle, no loss. She handed it down to him, and for a moment neither of them moved. The orchard behind the barn was no longer a symbol of waiting. It was bearing proof. They worked side by side through the afternoon, filling basket after basket with fruit that caught the light in soft shades of red and gold. Sweat gathered at the edges of Elias's collar, and Clara's sleeves were dusted with pollen and leaf fragments. But there was no rush in their movements. Each apple was lifted with care, placed gently rather than tossed. When the baskets were full, they carried them to the porch and set them beneath the carved sign that had weathered into the grain of the wood above. The join names no longer looked newly cut. They looked settled. Clara wiped her hands on a clean cloth and leaned back against the porch post, studying the fruit spread out before them. "My grandmother would have called this a miracle," she said softly. Elias picked up one apple and turned it slowly in his hand, inspecting its smooth curve. "It is not a miracle," he replied. "It is time and patience." Clara smiled faintly. "Sometimes that is the same thing." The wind moved across the fields, stirring tall grass and long, even waves that did not stop at property lines. Cattle grazed calmly in the distance, and the fence stood firm but unremarkable, part of the land rather than a statement. Inside the house, the iron box remained on the hearth, untouched for months now, no longer needed as evidence of what had been. Its purpose had been fulfilled the moment understanding replaced silence. As the sun lowered toward the western edge of the prairie, casting long amber light across porch boards and orchard rows alike, Elias reached for Clara's hand without hesitation. She did not pull away. There was no urgency in the gesture, no claim being staked, only acknowledgement of shared ground. The apples rested heavy in their baskets, real and undeniable. The trees that once refused to bear fruit now stood proven, their branches strengthened by seasons of quiet endurance. And beneath a sky wide enough to hold every unspoken promise, Elias understood that what had once been buried beneath floorboards was never meant to remain hidden. It had been waiting for steady hands and patient hearts, for a season brave enough to let it grow in the open air. Late September returned with the kind of golden light that makes the prairie look endless and forgiving. The last of the apples had been gathered, their weight stored in crates along the cool back wall of the house, the scent of fruit and clean wood mingling in quiet harmony. Clara Bennett stood on the porch at dusk, hands resting lightly on the railing Elias Whitaker had sanded smooth nearly a year before. The carved sign above the doorway had darkened with sun and rain, its letters no longer sharp at the edges but strong, settled into the grain as if they had always belonged there. Beyond the yard, the fence line stretched straight and steady, not as a reminder of division, but as proof of care. Cattle grazed calmly on Elias's pasture to the east, their movements slow and unhurried, while the orchard behind Clara's barn held branches lighter now, relieved of the fruit they had finally learned to bear. The iron box remained on the hearth inside, closed and undisturbed, not forgotten, but no longer needed to explain anything. Some truths had already done their work. Elias stepped onto the porch beside Clara without announcing himself. He did not have to. The rhythm of his presence had become as familiar as wind through grass. For a while they simply watched the sun lower toward the horizon, its amber light spilling across both properties without choosing one over the other. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if they had left?" Clara asked softly, her gaze still fixed westward. Elias considered the question with the same patience he once gave to setting beams and tightening wire. "If they had left," he said, "this house would not stand. These trees would not have roots. We would not be here." Clara nodded once. There was no bitterness in her expression, no sense of loss. only understanding. The past had not been a mistake. It had been a foundation. The prairie wind moved gently around them, lifting dust in faint spirals that settled just as quickly. Somewhere in the distance a meadowlark called, its song thin but certain against the wide sky. Elias reached for Clara's hand as naturally as he would reach for a hammer at dawn. She turned her palm toward his without hesitation. There were no grand vows spoken beneath that sky, no ceremony beyond the steady alignment of two lives that had already proven their patience. The fence remained upright. The orchard stood rooted. The house held warmth as evening deepened and the first stars began to show, faint and steady. And in the quiet that followed the setting sun, there was no trace of the secrecy that once lay buried beneath old floorboards. There was only open land, shared ground, and the kind of peace that does not demand to be declared. Out here, justice did not arrive with noise or spectacle. It came in the form of hands willing to build, hearts willing to wait, and the courage to let what was once hidden stand in plain sight. And as darkness settled gently across the prairie, the homestead remained lit from within, not by fire alone, but by the quiet certainty that some love stories do not end when they are denied. They endure, patient as the land, until someone brave enough chooses to finish them without ever raising a voice.